We'll do it live.
Okay. No.
We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Major of I Read a TV coming to you today. It is January 4th. It's a Wednesday and it's a brand new year, and we're going to be talking about something very, very exciting, which is the death of Globalism Round 3. This is going to be based on, I guess, a combination of three things, which is Carol Quigley, our favorite historian, Peter Zeihan, our new guy that we've discovered, who's a geopolitical and demographic analyst who is saying some pretty profound things, and some good ol' MMT, modern money theory. That's right. If you didn't know any better, you would think we are crazy progressives, but we refute that, even if you might think that that's the case. But we were talking for a couple episodes now, looking at the current state of globalism as defined by the fact that the United States patrols the world's oceans and has done so since the end of World War II in order to ensure safe passage of goods so that individual countries don't have to provide their own security. And this has allowed a completely different world to crop up that has never existed on the face of the earth. And that system is on the verge of going away because the United States is no longer interested in being the naval protector of everybody else's goods, because the entire point of that was to create a united bloc against the Soviet Union, which dissolved, obviously, in, 91? I think that's the official date for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? 1991. And when you couple
the end of the Cold War.
Yes, when you couple these factors with the depopulation crisis that we appear to be heading into, with the baby boomers more or less around the world failing to adequately reproduce themselves, now entering retirement, and after retirement, of course, they leave the face of the planet, leaving us behind with not enough people to fill their place. This creates very interesting pressures. We talked about this last 2 shows ago, I think, particularly regarding China and Russia. We got a little bit into Germany and we got into the United States as well, but because, particularly China has been such this big world player that's been this central turning gear to the economic systems of pretty much everywhere on Earth, looks like it's about to nosedive like a Boeing 747 straight into the ground. That changes things significantly on Earth. So, if you want to know more about the geopolitical situation and the demographic situation, please go back and check out those episodes. But right now, we're going to talk about the financial situation. We talked about this last time, right? Because these incredible predictions and data analysis that's been coming from this guy, Peter Zeihan, he also includes financial analysis, and anyone who knows us or has watched us for more than an episode or two knows we don't exactly fit in with the mainstream when it comes to economics. In fact, our claim is that the current economic understanding, whether that's neoclassical or even Austrian, is on its head when it comes to comparing it to reality, right? So we wanted to offer this as a critique of, first of all, a critique of Peter Zeihan's financial analysis of the world, and I guess we're probably going to focus mostly on the United States here, but also looking at, okay, well, if we put our MMT hats on, what do we see that this means based on the geopolitical and demographic data that he's provided as well? So Nima appears to be focusing more on reading Peter Zeihan's books. I appear to be focusing more on watching his videos. So hopefully we'll be able to come at this from at least some sort of two different angles. But Nima, could you offer the breakdown of what's in store financially, at least according to the mainstream view that Peter Zeihan is advocating, that is going to be contributing to this collapse of everything that's just around the corner.
Yeah. First of all, we just got a comment that I just want to share from a viewer. I haven't watched his financial predictions yet, but will later. I hadn't watched Zeihan until recently, but in the first stuff I saw by him, he predicted of the zero COVID protests would bring down Xi and that Ukraine would take Crimea. I think those are not good predictions. My bias is anti-China, pro-Russia. Okay, so let me comment on that.
I want to comment on that one too.
So he made some bad calls about the Russia-Ukraine thing starting in February or so, I believe. And yes, I agree with you on that. And he said that the COVID protests would bring down Xi.
He said
because
it could.
I've read a little.
Sorry,
So because I read a little more, I'm halfway through his book right now. That's not the only thing. The bigger picture is to Zeihan regarding China is that they are facing a demographic crisis, unlike anything we've ever seen anywhere else in the world, ever. And they're facing an economic crisis because of the bigger picture issue of the U.S. is not going to patrol global trade any longer. And China depends on that almost more than anyone else. China doesn't have very good soil, very good arable land. China doesn't have enough or nearly enough oil to feed itself. So China needs to import a whole bunch of stuff to survive, to feed its people, to keep the lights on. And they need to export a bunch of stuff to pay for those things. And import, export, all dependent on this super safe, super secure global trade protected by the U.S. Navy, is not going to be the case for much longer. So he's saying that China is moving into, is going, even before the zero COVID protests and all of this. This book was written in February of 2022. He says China is moving into a political basket case situation that could blow up anywhere at any point in time. And that will lead to possible revolutions, possible splintering apart into different factions within the country, all kinds of basket case scenario stuff. So, yeah, Xi is still there, obviously,
and
but
then, I could add something to China
right now. But
yeah, I can add something to China. So Peter Zeihan did point out. I've watched several videos of him discussing this. Is he says as an opening is if we look at the historicity of China. Like, what typically happens is that China, I mean, as much as they try to portray themselves as this unified country and this unified people, is really, really economically diverse. And he even I meant to say ethnically diverse. And it's also economically diverse in the sense that he pointed out that, like, you know, okay, in rich areas, people are richer, and poor areas, people are poorer. In the United States, you say, okay, let's compare New York to West Virginia, and maybe, you know, the people in New York make twice as much money as the people in West Virginia. In China, you have areas, it's not 1 to 2, it's 1 to 10. So there's these massive, not just ethnic disparities, but economic disparities, and that typically in Chinese history, once the ruler has in quotes unified the country and a similar situation starts to occur, one of two things happens. The first is everything breaks down into warring tribes, which this is where we get the Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Dynasty Warriors video games from, right? Everything breaks down into warring factions, and you get warlords fighting over control. Or the emperor, in this case Xi, right? Super duper clamps down and goes ultra mega authoritarian to stomp out any sort of dissent. And so with these COVID protests, what I'm understanding that Zeihan is predicting here is that we're starting to see conditions in China similar to conditions in past China where something like this has happened before. Now, the update that I heard from his initial prediction is that apparently Xi has relaxed Xi has relaxed COVID restrictions and has said, okay, local authorities can now implement their own COVID restrictions in order for them to be flexible. However, the problem that still comes with that is the fact that everybody's still fucking terrified of him. And so if you're bad, you get punished because you were bad. And if you're good, you get punished because you just made Xi look bad. So I don't think that his predictions are off the table yet. Xi just may have pushed it down the road a hair.
Yes, and bigger picture, just the fact that you have these protests, pretty vigorous protests and pretty violent protests at times. I mean, violent in the sense people are using violence to defend themselves, which I'm not saying that's illegitimate or whatever, but it's all symptoms of the country going crazier and crazier at the moment. And this is all stuff that he has already, his big picture analysis accounts for these kinds of things.
Xi is just kind of a flavor on top of the big picture analysis.
Yes,
he's like frosting.
Because he's all aside from the demographics, economics, trade issues that they're facing. He also says that Xi has consolidated more power than any Chinese dictator ever has in history.
Well, any human ever has in history.
More than Mao.
Yeah.
So,
He said over any human in history. Really? I'm guessing because of the advanced social credit network stuff that previous dictators never could have dreamed of.
Yeah. The Klaus.
The Klaus Schwab wet dreams. Yes. Yes. There's one other important point I wanted to mention on what you said about China regarding the fact that the U.S. is no longer going to guard world trade. Peter Zeihan also pointed out China doesn't have the ability to guard its own trade from a naval sense because its navy is piss poor. And at least according to whatever data that he's able to get, China can navally project maximum 1,500 miles, and that's assuming they're not under fire. If they're under fire, it's 350 miles.
I didn't know this. He writes in his book, China has 2 carriers. One of them used to be a cruise ship.
And the second one is modeled after the one that used to be a cruise ship. So, is China a paper dragon or not? I think paper might be a little stronger than the situation that they're looking at. So, Russia, right. He did bring up Russia too. Do you want to address the Ukraine predictions that he was wrong with?
His outlook for Russia in general is not great, but maybe better because Russia is at least still going to have the ability to feed its people and to have enough oil for electricity, etc. With the Ukraine war, the Ukrainians keep getting supplies from the U.S. Up until now. They've received I don't know how many billions in arms at this point. So that is helping them fight back against Russia. And Russia apparently doesn't really have the capacity to conduct a
modern ground war.
Ground war. So, so what did he say here? He predicted that
Ukraine would take back Crimea.
Yeah, so that remains to be seen, I think.
Well, and then the most recent update I heard from him on the Ukraine war is that at this time of year, everything has frozen over, and then there's going to be a period of mud, and then after the period of mud, things are going to heat up again. And what happened right before the freeze is that Russia, I mean, take this with a grain of salt with the fog of war and all that, all that sort of stuff. But Russia appears to have bungled this offensive so badly, particularly with their supply chains and their follow-up, is that so many Russians have had to run away and leave equipment behind that the most recent equipment capture of the by the Ukrainians of Russia. I can't remember the multiple. It's something like 4 times or something more than the entire West has given them to date. I don't remember if it was 4 or what, but it was multiple times more than the West has given to date. And he said during this period of freeze, they're going to have 3 or 4 or whatever months to integrate and train on this new equipment. So it's really, really up in the air right now. And he also mentioned that one of the reasons that the West is so voraciously supporting the Ukraine to the point where, and you know, I don't know who the commenter was. He says he's pro-Russian. I mean, I'm pro-Russian based on the fact that the news media is just, you know, shoving Ukraine down my throat, right? But when you look at Peter Zeihan's analysis, which is that what Russia is doing, I mean, it's multifaceted, but one of the most important parts of it is the fact that Russia is attempting to extend to its historical choke points, because Russia, unlike Europe, is flat. And if somebody wanted to invade, there's no way to, like, you know, create a border, or, you know, where the movie 300, we're going to guard this passage with 300 people and hold off the army of Persia, because the passage, they can't do that. People could just roll over Russia, and in modern times with modern vehicles, you could drive pretty fast. So since the fall of the Soviet Union, they've lost those choke points, and Peter Zeihan is arguing that since Putin took power, I think in 2001, he is super focused on getting those choke points back. Now, in the Ukraine, there are none of those choke points. All the choke points that
Putin was already 99 already, and one of the first things that he did, or his claim to fame at the time, was the what's the region called? Chechnya.
Yeah.
I mean,
that was one of the choke points.
And Chechnya is a very important location for Russia. It's right where the Caspian Sea is. That's where the oil comes from. So, just to belabor that point.
Right. And so, none of these choke points are in Ukraine. They're beyond Ukraine. They're like in Poland doesn't border Ukraine, but they're like Moldova, for example. And so, what the West understands is that Russia is not intending to stop at the Ukraine. They plan on capturing the Ukraine and jettisoning off from there. Now, the issue then becomes, Ukraine's not in NATO, like we all frickin' know at this point, but the countries beyond there, some of them are. And what happened when Russia does this ground war and bungles it up so badly, apparently the West went, Russia doesn't know how to fight a modern war. And then they went, if we get in a modern ground war with Russia, we're gonna roll their asses. And then they went, if we roll their asses, then their only option is nukes. And so in order to prevent that from happening, the theater has to be kept in Ukraine, which isn't a NATO ally. Now, well, yes, I don't know how much everybody believes that to its fullest extent, but that is a very interesting way of looking at it.
Maybe the compromise will end up being Russia takes some parts of eastern Ukraine, and the western part of Ukraine remains pro-Europe, etc. Mm-hmm. Whether or not they're going to join NATO, maybe they'll become neutral. Who knows? But a lot of the things you're saying there in terms of, we realized Russia can't fight a modern ground war. We have to
take with a grain of salt.
Yeah, everything that Peter Zeihan says, I realize that now. We have to take it with a grain of salt, so apply some of your own thinking to it. I mean, you always should do that, but he provides such a big picture. That's why we appreciate what he's done, because we've been trying to get a sense of the Quigley's big picture analysis of where we're going now. So for that, he's helpful. He does have good understanding of trade, I think. He does have some good understanding of geopolitics, geological factors that lead to success and or failure, and demographics as well. So for the big picture, I give him a pass. He's going to make mistakes on the details here and there. We'll get to his take on cryptocurrency, for example, in a little bit. So yeah, just saying, obviously, take everything he says with a grain of salt, because he, in my opinion, he obviously makes a deliberate effort not to offend or
His
not
clients.
to. Right. So his clients, among others, are the DoD and really high-level corporate corporations and maybe even intelligence. I don't know. So when it comes to controversial topics, he just defaults back to the corporate media talking points and to the safe line. Like the one thing where he just almost cowardly, I would say, he doesn't want to comment on the climate scam, but everything he says is obviously, it makes it very clear how much of a scam electric vehicles, the theory of catastrophic man-made climate change are. So he stays quiet on that.
Well,
People asked him to talk. I remember so they asked about the risks of climate change, and he basically suggests he said, "Well, yeah, I don't really think maybe there's some regions that will experience this or that issue," just to not make it sound like he denies the official dogma.
Well, and then here's this point too. Let's talk about climate change for a second. I 100% believe in climate change, and I think the sun is doing some pretty crazy stuff right now that's affecting the climate. But I don't think that taxing me and removing cow farts, I don't think that is doing a goddamn thing. I mean, whatever is actually happening with the climate is sun related. Give me a break.
That's why I'm saying the theory of catastrophic man-made climate change.
Yes.
That's the one. That's the hypothesis that we disagree with, and a lot of people disagree with, believe it or not.
So, we talked for 20 minutes on this question, which was an excellent question. I like that. That was really fun. Yeah. Let's get into into the financial aspect, which we want to critique here. So go back a show ago for us to get into detail here, but the overview, as I understand it, is first with, and I'm going to zoom in on the U.S. here, first with the United States baby boomers now entering retirement. They're going to be taking most of their stocks, bonds, or stocks and risky portfolios and moving them into safer things like bonds and cash because they're no longer earning an income and they can't handle the volatility, which is totally normal. And normally this doesn't do much to the economy except the fact that the baby boomer generation is the biggest generation that has ever hit the earth, and it's all happening at the same time. And the fallout from that essentially is a very, very large increase in the cost of capital and a very, very large increase in the cost of labor because these very experienced, this very experienced generation in terms of their job skills is leaving the workforce, right? And there's
just to be clear, we're primarily talking about non-U.S. demographics right now.
Well, even with the U.S., the baby boomer bubble is bigger than the replacement.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
but we'll get to the these minutiae.
So what? And then Nima's been reading more and more of the book, and he's gotten to the financial aspect. Give us the financial aspect from the book.
So far we have discussed the origins of society. I mean, so far we've discussed in his book. Section 1 is about how the modern world was created, basically how it all began, the geographies of success. Section 2 is about transport and how transport on very big ships has enabled this incredibly cheap global transport to the point where the price of a product, something like 50 to 70% of it used to be made up by the shipping cost, to where now it's like 0.5% or 0.1% or something like that, because you can put so much stuff into containers and can put so many containers onto a giant container ship that per product the transportation costs has come down significantly. So, and of course now the problem with that is that if we're not patrolling the oceans anymore, this will all become much more difficult, and the costs will go up, insurance costs will go up. A lot of people are just not going to do that kind of shipping anymore, he says. So he actually predicts that shipping will be conducted on smaller and smaller ships over time, not on these giant tankers. So then the next part that I got into is finance. That's the next section of his book. He starts by discussing the history of money. So he talks about how different countries in Mesopotamia, in the Mesopotamian era, would barter with each other for international trade, basically. So one of them could provide some good, the other some other good, copper and barley and whatnot. This was this Bronze Age, or when is it Bronze Age?
Yeah, this is Bronze Age. Bronze Age is like
I think it ends in 1200 BC or something.
Yeah,
exactly. So he talks about how during the Mesopotamian civilization and what we've called in our discussions the age of the agrarian empires, they established something called the barley standard, where barley became a big medium of international trade. And then the shekel became a currency based on barley. So the shekel became an international currency, international to that region, of course, that you could redeem against barley. And that has sort of harmonized and allowed for some trade in that region to some extent. This is not counter to MMT, because MMT does not deny that barter did happen on an international scale from country to country. One country produces something, another is better at something else. They come to an agreement to
well, and then there's still going to be an accounting unit between the two.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, at one point, as the thing advances, he also talks about the problems where at one point there was no real unit yet. So how do you value so and so much copper versus so and so much barley? And then what about tomorrow? Is it going to be the same tomorrow? Do you have predictability? All these things. So that's why the common currency, the shekel, was invented. And a little fast forward. I wouldn't say that he has looked into MMT or anything like that. So some of his analysis has some neoclassical economic undertones, I would say. But I think, it's still useful, big picture. He suggests that the fiat age began sometime around the time of the Spanish Empire. Sorry, no, that was silver. So they started using silver because they could mine so much silver in Peru, the Spaniards, that they started flooding the world with silver, basically, and silver became a common currency.
And most of it ended up in China. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I don't think so,
Yeah.
but we've talked about that. But so 1971, then the U.S. goes off the gold standard. He says that was a big change because capital had become less scarce. And I think he's right about that, because as we've discussed, the gold standard forces the government to do austerity and forces a general reduction of production below what would
the
be
liquidity is
possible.
not available for the general populace.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. It's not easy to get a loan. There's stricter criteria because the banks are the government is forced to reduce its deficits. And as we've discussed before, that's an arbitrary thing, right? It's the thing that Carol Quigley has also discussed this in Tragedy and Hope. The banking establishment has generally always been pro gold standard,
Right?
And because the gold standard forces lower inflation, forces lower deficits, lower inflation, and for a bank that makes fixed interest income, that's something they're paranoid about, inflation, because they don't want to.
Deflation benefits the lender. Yes.
Yeah. So then 1971, this changed. if there was a singular rule of finance in the area before 1971, it was that there was never enough money. Currency value was directly linked to some sort of asset, blah, blah, blah. So then came a new era of easy money, easy financing. And he starts by talking about the Asian financial model, interestingly. He says the Asian financial model was based on the notion that capital should serve politics, not the economy. Mm-hmm. So you could achieve political goals by financing everything. And we've also discussed this when we talked about Professor Werner, because and actually Zeihan also mentioned this in this book here. The Japanese economy was obviously in shambles after World War II. Everything bombed to rubble. The debts on the banks, the debts on the balance sheets of the banks were all worth nothing, and then the Japanese central bank bought all these debts at par value.
At value. Well, like if the debt was for $1,000, they bought it for $1,000, not $500.
As though they could pay it back. So that that goes hand in hand with his analysis of the Asian financial model. The Chinese financial and the Japanese, they have been more open to deficit spending and also just plain old bank lending, which is really just another form of government spending, especially in a country such as China, where
they control everything.
Banks are state-owned, essentially. So that's the time of easy credit. Then he calls it the Great Conflation, the Euro model. The Europeans are more reserved than the Asians when it comes to finance, but that's a bit like saying Joanne Rivers didn't like plastic surgery as much as Cher. So the Europeans are maybe a little more reserved, not fundamentally different in that regard at this point. And then he goes into the American model, and also the Americans, obviously. Now, the Americans are not exactly known for fiscal responsibility, right? So he says, don't make the mistake of thinking the Americans don't have that issue. But the Americans have a lot more to back it up, and they do have some advantages that the other countries don't have. Easy business formation, and obviously lots of natural resources, lots of geopolitical safety, all these things. But he says here, for example, something that did happen in America as a result of the post-1971 world, the world of more abundant capital, is that, well, I may just read it here. Exxon produced the crude oil in foreign. So the simple model pre-1971, capital scarcity. Exxon produced the crude oil in foreign countries. Exxon shipped the crude home via tankers. Exxon refined the crude into fuel at refineries it owned. Exxon distributed that fuel to retail stations. Exxon's network of franchisees sold the fuel to consumers. Post-1971, however, the laws of capital were, if not repealed, then certainly loosened. The new structure of capital supported risk-taking almost by default. New firms popped up to handle discrete tasks such as prospecting or transport or refining, rather than the full well-to-customer chain. These new firms swam alongside or even within the internal system of the major energy players. And then he starts talking about Enron, how Enron created basically the market for all these different suppliers to somehow be integrated with one another. And then Enron went nuts and started, doing all kinds of other things. And he also talks about. But then, so the important point is, this has enabled the U.S. to become energy independent, because all this entrepreneurship in the oil and the energy sector has led to the shale revolution, which has led to the fact that the U.S. can now supply all the oil and gas that it could possibly need. And so he says, while things have been done that were crazy and excessive, we still have all this knowledge and all the companies and the processes and the infrastructure in place to keep the lights on in our country. So then he gets to demographics and capital. So his big picture is basically that during the time when the baby boomers still were in their jobs, so they were mature workers, and mature workers are those workers who make more money than everyone else and who consume less than the younger workers.
Right, because they don't have kids anymore. They've already bought their house. They've already bought their cars,
Right.
etc.
Yeah, but their house, but their car, so the big ticket items they've already spent, they're accumulating money, and that money becomes available to put into the stock market.
Usually through their 401k programs or IRAs.
Right. So he's saying that is, in most parts of the world, that is going to go away because of the demographic decline, because these mature workers are going away. So there's not going to be so many people anymore who want to buy stocks with their 401ks, etc. Sorry, not 401, because he also talks about how this will not be as big a problem in the US because, number one, the US has the largest millennial generation in the world. And as the millennials mature into higher earning jobs, etc., they will still be able to do this. Not as much as the baby boomers before, but at least the U.S. has that advantage. And
we
also
have somebody here to replace them, and most other countries.
Yes, and also,
don't.
Interestingly, what he says about the U.S. is that the inequality in America is going to be a big advantage for us because very rich people are less likely to do that thing that you said earlier, where they sell their stocks and buy treasuries and
go conservative with their finances.
Yeah, exactly. So in the U.S., because of inequality, because of this giant amount of cash that's sitting in the bank accounts of the 1%, they won't be impelled to that extent to sell their stocks. They can bear the volatility, because the reason why we're selling the stocks is when we're older is because we don't want the volatility. But to the super wealthy, it doesn't really matter as much. They're still going to keep some money in the stock market. Mm-hmm. But I think the most interesting part maybe would be to go through his specific predictions for a select list of countries as a result of the capital supply dwindling away and the other issues of transport, etc. So he says, okay, so first of all, he talks about Greece. Okay, he says, the Greeks were admitted into the Eurozone despite not meeting, well, any of the requirements with regards to debts and deficits. Then they proceeded to act like a college dropout wielding a distant step-parent's platinum credit card. Total credit expanded by a factor of 7 in just 7 years. The bill eventually came due, the country crashed, and during the following 3 years, the Greek economy proceeded to implode by twice as much in relative terms as the United States did during the Great Depression. By 2019, things were looking, if not better, then at least not quite as bad. Enter COVID. As a tourism-dependent economy, Greece once again dropped into freefall. If the country continues to exist at all, it will be as a ward of someone else. Then Germany. Germany, unsurprisingly, is the polar opposite. The Germans are remarkably conservative in their financial dealings, both as people and a government. But qualifying for a mortgage first requires making regular mortgage-like payments into a sequestered bank account. It's called Bausparvertrag, by the way, in case anyone's wondering. For several years to prove attitudes and bona fides. As such, the Germans avoided the sort of catastrophic financial collapses that bedeviled much of Europe in the 2007 through 2009 crisis. One result among many was that the German economy bounced back first and fastest, leading firms across the continent to put their eggs in the German basket while the rest of Europe withered. 2 cheers for the Germans, but only 2. The establishment of all things German at Europe's center bred resentment throughout Europe.
Asterisk on that. Now, we know from an MMT perspective that a lot of this is simply just set up for the fact that Germany's net export, Greece's net import, and they all have a foreign currency, the euro. Well, no individual country has control over the euro. There's this European Central Bank, which, for all intents and purposes, acts like a foreign country and acts like a foreign currency. So when Greece, and I'm not saying those things aren't true, and that but the Greece politicians aren't corrupt or whatever, but we do know simple extension of credit doesn't destroy you. What destroys you is lack of public sector net savings, and because they're not. Greece isn't able to print its own public sector net savings, kinda, and they have this massive trade deficit. Whereas Germany, because they export, they have this mass trade in surplus. They could sit back and go, "Well, look how conservative and responsible we are," right? When in reality,
asterisk on the asterisk. Germany no longer has an export surplus, I don't think, ever since oil prices went up so much. But go ahead.
Well, okay, so up until that point, that they have this surplus in their trade deficit, and again, I'm not saying that the Germans aren't fiscally responsible and that's good or bad, or the Greeks aren't fiscally responsible and that's good or bad, but the primary issue here is foreign currency, the euro, and private sector net savings when you can't access it through the central government, because the central government is essentially a foreign government in the Eurozone when it comes to money, and the only place you can get it from then is your trade surplus or deficit. Well, Germany has a trade surplus and Greek has the trade deficit. There you go. Right? Nima's sharing something.
Yeah, just real quick, this is the German current account surplus over time.
And a big drop.
So here's where we are now. So it's dropped near zero, but it's still a little bit in the positive. But definitely the years of Germany as this export country have come to a pause for now, at least, related to the gas issue, the Russia situation, all of that, I suspect.
Right, and anyway, which, according to Peter Zeihan, it has a good chance of never actually getting resolved. But again, we'll see into the future.
So also, referring back to our MMT analyses in the past, when you restrict your government's ability to deficit spend, then the private sector will go into private debt. So bank credit is going to explode. And that's exactly what he's talking about here. The Greeks have been so crippled economically due to the restrictions of the European Treaty that they've had to borrow a bunch of money in the private sector. And a lot of credit expansion beyond the private sector's income to pay the debt, that is indeed bad credit expansion. Right. That is problematic. And so that's what he talks about here with the credit expanded by a factor of 7, in just 7 years. So, that's very, very fast.
Like I said, maybe that is too fast. But again, this is still predicated on the idea that the country does not have the ability to create its own money.
Yes.
In the MMT sense that we've described in previous episodes.
Right. They do have the ability to create euros, but there's a cap.
Yeah, so that's what I meant. Kinda. But but if they're going 7 times in 7 years and there's a cap on their ability to do the private sector net savings, that's probably too much too fast. Yes.
Yep. A far from insignificant amount of that resentment put down roots in the United Kingdom, where the 2007 through 2009 crisis emboldened economic and ethnic nationalists to push for separating the kingdom from the European Union. As part of the ensuing struggle, Britain's political right and left both imploded. Populists ultimately took control of the British political right and led the kingdom through the haphazard process we know today as Brexit, while the left fell under the control of barely whitewashed neo-fascists for a time. For a time? What are you talking? And how is that not the left?
The case.
How is that not the left the world over, by the way? Anyway, the credit build in Hungary in the 2000s was among Europe's biggest, expanding by a factor of 8. Much of that capital flooded into the housing market in a way that would make American subprime financiers blush. putting people with minimal income or credit histories into homes they could not pretend to afford. Making matters worse, most of the loans were in foreign currencies, so when the inevitable currency swings occurred, even Hungarians who were able to afford their homes under normal circumstances suddenly saw their mortgage payments double. The ensuing economic and financial chaos hardened the political landscape against outsiders of all flavors, and then he talks some crap about Viktor Orban that I'm not going to read out because
You don't like
it's
it. Well,
What?
let's introduce something here. What he mentioned that all this credit is swamping into the housing market. Well, what did Professor Richard Werner say? Is basically because the entire banking cabal, whether they're doing it through ignorance or nefariousness, they don't understand, or they're pretending not to understand, that banks don't need assets. Like holding hard assets to protect them from economic crashes doesn't do anything. And so when you've got this idea that the banks should be holding hard assets, and therefore they should be lending to assets, they're creating money, because that's what banks do. They create money. They're creating money for, I mean, honestly, a house is essentially a consumer good. Not 100%, but in the sense of this, it's a consumer good. So you're just racking up the cost of these consumer goods. Of course, it's going to be inflationary, as opposed to emphasizing money creation for producing businesses, because then you get money creation and you get goods and services increasing at the same time, which theoretically hedges the inflation. So, I mean, this is another traditional. This is another casualty of the traditional neoclassical understanding of economics and a misunderstanding of the banking system to say, okay, well, all right, banking system, get out those home loans, get lots and lots of home loans out there, and create that asset bubble that doesn't actually produce anything. Because, as mentioned before, the only thing, a good loan is simply one where the payments are made. And like you said, if the private sector goes into debt with itself beyond its ability to finance it, then they're bad loans now. Well, emphasizing asset loans by default creates that situation. And it seems to be that we're emphasizing these asset loans due to a stark misunderstanding of how the banking system works. Basically, that it creates money, it does not lend out deposits.
Right. Singapore has a big credit signature with a 5-fold increase in credit since 2000. But Singapore is a financial center and so is constantly investing in places outside of itself. Much of its private credit is wrapped up in foreign economies. Additionally, Singapore has a government investment agency, Temasek, that is responsible for funneling a lot of the city-state's money into projects abroad. Factor those items out and the picture doesn't look all that bubbly. That said, Singapore sits on the Strait of Malacca, the world's busiest trade route, and serves as the world's largest transshipment center, to such a degree that its fuel tanks hold and manage the distribution of so much petroleum that they constitute a global price standard. Should anything happen to the velocity of global trade, Singapore's trade-centric economy could not help but suffer in the short term, regardless of how well managed the city's finances happen to be. So yeah, it's actually true. There's a Singapore oil index, I think. I just recalled that. So then he talks about Australia. Australia has avoided recession for a generation. Others noticed, and foreign money has spammed into the country to take advantage of the longest continuous period of economic growth in human history. That has turned the Great Down Under into the most overcredited of the Western countries, and to not yet experience a credit collapse. Credit has increased 6-fold since 2000. Housing and household debt are, of course, the expected bugaboos, but the credit inflows have pushed the Australian dollar up to uncomfortably unsustainable highs, eroding the competitiveness of every economic sector outside of mining. That's actually, the Aussie dollar has crashed quite a bit over the past couple of months, so that may not apply anymore. But that maybe big picture, it's still the case. I don't know. And then he says, this will blow. The question is when. In Colombia, so just to summarize, he says Colombia has struggled with the civil war and all that stuff for a while, so their credit binge was, if anything, about regaining lost ground. The challenge moving forward will be to win the peace by demonstrating to those on both sides of the war that not shooting at one another is good for business. The most likely path? Easy credit for all to spark infrastructure development and consumer activity. Colombia's credit binge isn't in its past, it's in its future. So, if for investors out there, Colombia might be interesting.
Colombia might be interesting, yeah.
Indonesia as a country I tend to be bullish about for a mix of reasons. A large, young, upwardly mobile population. A government that by design focuses on the densely populated island of Java, enabling it to concentrate its efforts on a fairly specific and politically unified geography. Broad-scale energy security. An excellent location astride the world's most prolific trade routes. And proximity to the massive mineral and agricultural exporters of Australia and New Zealand, on one hand, and to the complementary industrial and financial partners of Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia on the other. To this, I add a surprisingly conservative credit profile. Yes, overall credit in the Southeast Asian country has risen by a factor of more than 7, but economic growth has outpaced it. Back in 2000, overall credit was equal to GDP, something that would normally be more than a little worrying for a poor, sprawling country like Indonesia. But despite year-on-year rises in absolute credit for the next 17 years, the ratio of credit to the overall economy has actually fallen by a third. Indonesia still faces a bevy of significant challenges. But the country's overcrediting is far less concerning than the headline figures would suggest. The credit picture of Brazil is a reasonable echo of Greece. A six-fold increase peaking in 2014. In that year, investor sentiment in the Brazilian political system broke at the same time, triggering a political crisis and deep recession at the time of this writing shows no sign of abating. Making matters worse, Brazil's constitution and currency only date back to the 1990s. Not only is this modern Brazil's first true political and economic crisis, but it is a full-blown constitutional crisis that hits at the very bedrock of everything that makes Brazil Brazil.
Well, I guess we could just add on the recent total legitimate election that they had to that.
Yeah. Right. Actually, I remember reading that they either passed a law or the Supreme Court decided that that the election result. So if you win an election and turns out you spread misinformation during the campaign, the election could be nullified. So.
Sounds about right. Sounds about and right after that.
The idea that a politician doesn't spread misinformation during a campaign is just so hilarious. I mean, you have to be so demented to think that is a serious law that makes sense.
I like the German gesture there.
Yeah.
Du musst ein Vogel haben.
Vogel.
Yeah.
Ein Vogel. Given that it has been the world's largest oil exporter for the past 50 years, the word credit isn't what normally comes to mind when one thinks of Saudi Arabia. Yet the Saudis have quite successfully leveraged their oil income stream to acquire rafts of credit for all portions of their system, generating a boom of 750% of credit since 2000. As this credit is backed by unrelenting income, it probably is not as problematic as the situation in Brazil or Australia, and certainly not as bad as Greece. But most of the credit has gone either to vanity projects in the desert or to subsidies for the population or to purchase citizen loyalty. When the flow breaks, and it will, that loyalty will crumble. Luckily for the Saudi leadership, the country's internal security services are among the world's most effective at quelling dissent. Credit in India is up by a cool factor of 10 since 2000, with barely a dip along the way. The steady drumbeat of economic expansion has made India a far calmer place politically than its constant bouts of famine and religious and racial churn would suggest. When the correction inevitably arrives, it will be epic. I'm perfectly capable of being bullish on India for reasons geopolitical and demographic, while simultaneously warning of a hell of a financial crisis. In Turkey, the picture is getting complicated. Between 2000 and 2013, total credit increased by more than a factor of 12, one of the sharpest and most sustained increases in the world. The boom granted Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, the political capital required to consolidate control over an often fractious system, ending decades of uncomfortable cohabitation between his own Anatolian religious conservatives, the pro-Western modernizers of the greater Istanbul region, and a secularized military that saw itself as the guardian of the state. Now there's only Erdogan, but in 2013 the credit expansion stopped in its tracks. The loss of economic legitimacy, the pressure of 3 million refugees from Syria, and rising geopolitical hostility from and toward Europe, Russia, Iraq, and the US mean Erdogan's rule has become brittle, harsh, and increasingly authoritarian. And all that before Turkey suffers the inevitable credit correction.
Are all of these countries signed on to the Basel approach, do you think?
Most of them, I think.
Well, I mean, man, I got a tinfoil hat growing out of my head right now, because if these are all signed on to the Basel approach, which is as Richard Warner points out, it's basically an idea that promotes creating credit for asset purchases, like we just described as a terrible idea. That's the international banking standard, is do really, really stupid stuff with your banks. And it sounds like, because Peter Zeihan's going over this credit expansion, and as we just emphasized, it depends on what the credit is expanding into. Is it expanding into productive businesses, or is it expanding into asset purchases? And then if we back that up with an MMT understanding, we go, well, what's the private sector net savings doing behind that? Right?
Yeah. So I'm just looking here. Germany is a member. Greece is not a member
of the Basel. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. Actually, but the European Union is a member, so it doesn't matter whether Greece. So
right.
Every European Union member country technically has agreed to this. France, Germany is member. China is a member. Brazil is a member. Australia is a member. Indonesia is a member. Japan.
Well, with China, I don't believe them on being a member of anything. Like, oh yeah, well, we'll do that. We'll do that. Do
Singapore, yeah. Saudi Arabia, Turkey.
Yeah, this lines up exactly with what you just said. So if all this, they got all this credit expansion that's dumping into assets, it sounds to me like a bubble is being intentionally pumped up here.
Right. At the time of this paragraph's edition, February 28, 2022, so he added this paragraph into this analysis, Russia is being melon-scooped out of global finance as punishment for the Ukraine war, the Russian central bank included. By the time you read this, the world will have a fascinating, horrific case study of true financial disintegration. Nor is Russia done. Beset with a population aging into decrepitude and a system that has given up educating the next generation, Russia's credit collapse is but one of a phalanx of factors capable of ending the Russian state. It's like, I don't know what he means when he says stuff like ending the Russian state. What do you mean? Like, country disappears?
I guess the control network disappears because...
Yeah.
I mean,
hold on. Maybe revolution.
Well, and let's talk about some of the factors of Russia that we didn't mention earlier. I may have picked some up from the videos that you haven't picked from the book. One of the really big ones that's happened since the Ukraine war started is something on the order of, last I checked like a month ago, 1 million Russian men have left the country because they don't want to get conscripted, because in Russian history, well, how do they fight wars? They just throw bodies at it, and if you try to run away, they shoot you. Right?
And I know I can confirm that from my anecdotal stories, because my fiance Katya is Russian, and her family has lots of friends who are trying to flee the country.
Yeah.
Trying to come to the U.S. through Mexico, all this stuff.
Well, hold on. I wanted to add this. So when you add that to the fact that the men that they are conscripting are getting sent to Ukraine as cannon fodder now, and Peter Zeihan points out historically Russia has never given up on a war until they have at least 500,000 dead. Add that to the decrepit population, right? Where one of the reasons that Peter Zeihan argues that Russia decided to go to war now is because now is the last fucking time ever that they'll have enough fighting age men to go to war because there's not going to be enough after a generation. Add that to the fact that the educational system is disintegrating. I watched another video on that basically so much is getting clamped down in the educational system that if you're a professor and you question the war, you get fired. We know what that looks like. So the educational system's disintegrating. So I agree with you. I don't understand what it means that the state will end, but these are big factors that are just going to be like, okay, the largest geographical political unit on Earth, can it hold itself together with this going on?
The question isn't will the Russians go out swinging. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is testament to that. But instead, who else will they swing at? Overcredited countries beware. Credit collapse can be caused by any number of actions or inactions. They do not require war or sanctions. Not to belabor the point, but the absolute financial blowout that is China has generated the largest and most unsustainable credit boom in human history, both in absolute and relative measures. The Chinese will exit the modern world just as they entered it, with a big splash. The only question is when. If I had the answer to that, you wouldn't be reading this book, because instead of struggling through edits, I'd be idling away my days on the Peter Virgin Islands.
Because you would have made appropriate investment decisions, I presume. Yeah.
I guess so, yeah. So here's a chart of total private credit. And I mean, I don't need you to see all the details, but just the biggest one there that's blowing up the chart, that's China. And the other one's like the US is somewhere down here. Credit expansion since 2000, basically. And so, sorry, but people talk about the US being financially crazy. This is the US here, this little line down here.
The dark black line on the bottom?
Yeah.
So we're the most conservative. Holy shit.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and this is another interesting takeaway from this chapter, is that the US at this point has the most stable banks in the world.
Stable in the sense of they have the most stable assets on their books.
The quality of the loans on the books of American banks are the safest and most stable out of any banks in the world. And that was the finance section. Next section he gets into. I just want to read the last little
paragraph,
sentence. Yeah. Finance. On top of that, if what we know, or at least what we think we know, is already fading away in America in the here and now, then what hope does the rest of the world have for figuring out the future? Now that everyone is cheered up, let's talk about what happens when the lights go out. And then he goes to energy. Next big section.
Well, let's mention this on finance, right? So, I mean, what he described, it sounds, as far as I can tell, accurate. Right, but I think what our conversation is able to bring to the table is that you can't necessarily snap your fingers and make all this stuff go away, but I think it can be ameliorated once you understand how the banking system and the monetary system works, right? Because I have heard him discuss in another video talking about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, and let me see if I can remember this argument correctly. He said that the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates because they see the demographic decline. And what they're doing is, by raising interest rates, they think they're going to be restricting spending, right? Because the money is going to get more expensive. So they're restricting spending by raising the rates. And the idea is once the boomer population passes into the various bubbles that end in no longer existing, the Federal Reserve will have the capacity that I guess we make a potential kinetic energy example of this. They will have built the potential energy to release over time in order to increase spending and productive capacity if they need to, by dropping the interest rates. Did you follow that, Nima, for the argument? Yeah. Now, MMTers know that the interest rates, they aren't just irrelevant. They kind of do the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Right? So, I've heard you point out before, okay, for that person over there or that person over there, yes, they may not be able to buy the car or the house they could have in the past, now that the interest rate has gone up. But in the aggregate, you are injecting more money into the system and making more capital available, particularly private sector net savings, which is the most important capital that we've got available. So
Yeah. It's been happening since the rates have gone up. We see that in the numbers, that just huge amounts of money getting injected. I mean, orders of magnitude more than was the case when the rates were near zero.
right. Well, I guess if you got
On the net.
on the net, what do you mean?
Well, because the loan costs have gone up. Okay, so people have to pay more money
For a
on
loan.
a loan.
Yeah.
So there's money leaving the private sector in that sector, in that particular subsection of it. But for every loan, there's a deposit, and the deposit holders are earning more money now by the same margin that the borrowing approximately the same margin the borrowing costs went up, and the interest rate on treasury bonds and notes and bills has also gone up. So
I get it. So the net, if we compare what's gone down versus what's gone up, we've had more up than down.
Right.
Yeah. So
raising interest rates by the Fed injects more money into the private sector. So it fails to achieve the objective that is based on the fairy tale that interest rates
Control the money
regulate
supply.
lending, control the money supply, anything like that. They increase the money supply, actually. So
well, and then again, it goes back to, okay, we're seeing these problems, and I'm being U.S. centric here. We're seeing these problems that are going to be coming out of the fact that the Fed's increasing interest rates, and all this boomer capital is about to leave the stock market, which presumably has various effects that will increase the cost of capital. But if we understand that the government prints the money, right? There's no such thing as the government collecting money and then spending it. Right? When it collects money, it vanishes into thin air, and when it prints money, it comes out of thin air and gets distributed. So, and then on the banking side, there's no taking of deposits and then lending out deposits. That doesn't happen. What happens is when a loan is made, that money's created out of nowhere and it's extended. So if at any point we're talking about credit crunches, I'm not saying it can be completely fixed by addressing this the way that we're describing, because money that comes from the private sector comes with different strings attached and expectations and different underwriting than the capital that comes from the commercial banking system. But specifically that, if the commercial banking system, if their limit is not deposits and not reserve ratios, but their limits are willing and able borrowers. A willing and able borrower, there's really two variables there. What's their income, and what's the frickin' regulation, right? If the regulation is, okay, we only make so many house loans, and even though you got the income, sorry, we only make so many house loans, or whatever.
There's three factors. Another factor is the risk of the borrower, basically. That the bank assesses.
Yes. Yeah. So by dialing those things around, you can completely change the availability of credit. We mentioned this in the last show. I mean, for example, recently I just did an SBA loan to acquire a business, and they put me through some fucking rigmarole to sign all the papers and get everything straight to get that SBA loan, which is that's what it's supposed to do. I get it, right? Because here's why. This is how an SBA loan works. I figured this out. You do not get money from the government for an SBA loan. And in fact, most SBA lenders are what's called SBA preferred. And what that means is they don't even need to talk to the government to make that SBA loan. So I got confused. I'm like, well, what is it then? So an SBA loan guarantees a certain amount of the money back. So let's say I buy this business, the next day I turn around and I default, that they lent me $100. They can go back to the federal government and say, hey, we lent this guy $100. We had an SBA guarantee on it. You give us a percentage back. That percentage is something like 75 cents on the dollar, right? So they get $75 back. So what what the bank was really putting me through the rigmarole for is when, if I were to default and they go back to the federal government to say, okay, we want this money back, there's some agent, there's some bureaucrat that goes, okay, show me all the stuff that you made sure that you followed the SBA rules before you handed out this loan, and if you didn't follow them, we don't give you the money. Right? So, if they change those rules, the banks are going to lend out SBA a lot more easily because they've got this, okay, what if it's 100% backed up instead of 75% backed up, right? What if they say, okay, well, do 20 things to assess for risk. That's what we were doing before. Now do 10 things to assess for risk, and that makes it that much more available. Oh, the maximum amount that someone can get on a SBA 7A loan is $5 million. Make it $10 million. Whatever, right? I mean, there's all, and I'm just focusing in on the SBA in this little corner of lending in the universe because I've interacted with it myself and I could say something about it. Right? This is all controlled by regulation. The money's created out of nowhere, both from the government and from the banking system. So if we ever in a capital crunch, the way that we increase the capital from those sectors is simply by addressing regulation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the idea is that, okay, just because there's fewer mature workers, so fewer people who want to buy stocks, that doesn't mean that can't be replaced by
exactly.
bank
Thank
lending,
you.
some other methodology. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, then again, if you're practical, pragmatist like Peter Zeihan, maybe he's also factoring in, well, how likely are these things to change politically?
Right. Well, we might agree with him on that.
Right. Is a political will there to make these changes? The kinds of changes that Professor Werner is asking for example, a community bank-based lending system.
Or what Warren Moser's asking for, which is like, payroll tax holiday or whatever.
Right. In the U.S., we're so used to everyone having stocks. I remember when I was growing up in Germany, not a lot of people had stocks. It wasn't really a common thing that everyone did. In fact, also on top of that, in Germany, a lot of people are promised a pretty big government pension. So that was considered their retirement. Then maybe they would buy some bonds and have money in savings accounts. So yeah. So let me comment.
Before we go too much farther, I do have something here coming up at 1:00. Which means I got 7 minutes to jump. So can you get your point out in that amount of time, or do we need to do another show? Okay, go for it.
Well, yeah, so just the idea why I obviously always take his stuff with a grain of salt, because his analysis of cryptocurrency is completely underwhelming to me and kind of almost a little bit shocking, considering that he's this future analyst about the future and the big trends and whatnot. Well, we've had cryptocurrency for 14 years now. It seems to be kind of relevant. He says that's a symptom of overcapitalization. Maybe all this swaths of capital that have been available from the mature workers
has created the excess liquidity that can say, okay, hey, I got some extra money, I'll buy some Bitcoin or whatever. That's yeah.
The same capital is also responsible for recent explosions of stupid. In early 2021, a bunch of gamers hurled so much capital into the video game platform GameStop that it briefly became one of America's most valuable firms, despite being about to file for bankruptcy. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are not backed by a government, are not readily exchangeable.
Can I interrupt on that one about the GameStop thing? That was a political move. Right, the whole GameStop thing was rallied around the idea that some big hedge fund had shorted GameStop, and they were trying to short squeeze them. It was a political move, not an investment move. Yeah,
they succeeded at short squeezing. The cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are not backed by a government. They are not readily exchangeable. Wrong. Are not useful in making payments. Wrong. Have no intrinsic value. Let's see.
We argue that the case, whether or not that's the case.
So right now, people are paying $16,800 for one Bitcoin. So also wrong. He says intrinsic value, as if any currency has an intrinsic value. Value is by definition extrinsic. Value is assigned by a human who sees value in a thing.
Right,
In a market,
which is, I mean, we're kind of hearing the barter theory of money, gold standard interpretation coming out of this.
Peter
Yes,
Schiff. This is Peter Schiff lingo. No, intrinsic value is a contradiction in terms, and are primarily generated by Chinese magnates seeking an end run around sanctions. Yet the combined value of all cryptos is in excess of 2 trillion. So, first of all, Bitcoin was not created by Chinese magnates, as far as we know. Nobody knows. The biggest experts in crypto.
Maybe he's referring to it being mined by Chinese magnates. Therefore, the new coins get created by them.
There's a lot of mining in China going on, but people don't need to mine Bitcoins to get around some sanction, right? They just need Bitcoin. They can buy it or whatever. Also, seeking an end run around sanctions. So I guess Bitcoin is useful to get around sanctions and make payments. But one sentence before that, he says it's not useful in making payments. I mean, it's like the most frictionless payment system the world has ever seen, and the most decentralized payment system the world has ever seen. So I don't know what he means by that. My personal favorite is something called Dogecoin, which was literally formed as it's such amateur talk on his part. It formed as a joke to highlight how idiotic crypto investors would be. Okay, that's true. Dogecoin is a silly little coin.
But everybody knows that. They know that, and they're like running with the joke.
He gets so excited with these talking points. At times, the total value of Dogecoins is top 50 billion. All of this and more is textbook overcapitalization of a nearly Chinese scale. When capital is cheap enough, even pigs can fly. Okay, that's all. That's all he has to say on cryptocurrency. But my point is just you have to be nuanced, right? So I've talked crap about the crypto market myself on our show off and on. And yeah, I'm very disappointed with where it has led at this point. That doesn't mean I believe that Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, isn't useful in making payments, is created by Chinese magnates. So I think again, this is just to illustrate. He casts such a wide net with his analysis. It's such a great endeavor that on the little things he sometimes just gets things completely wrong. And he comments on a topic that he obviously hasn't researched and probably maybe has no interest in researching.
Which is fine.
Which I think, yeah. I mean, it might make sense for him to look into the most novel technological innovation in the past several decades, and he says as a joke to highlight how idiotic crypto investors could be. Okay, so because me personally, I started buying Bitcoin in 2011, and it went up by 1.6 billion% since then, or something like that.
Right.
So that makes me an idiot, I guess. Okay, well, I'll take the money.
Yeah.
anyways.
Okay. Can I be an idiot like you, Nima?
Yeah.
Hey, Nima, I'm 2 minutes from 1.
Yeah.
Let's wrap this up.
done.
I think it was a great conversation. We can, I don't know, talk more crypto and world financial geopolitics at a future date. So this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of IRETA TV. We've been here doing it live. Please head over to IRETA.tv and follow us at the social media of your choice so you can get updates on when the live shows are going, and then they'll be uploaded later anyway. But head over to IRETA.tv and thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.